This video is going to be an overview of the major parts of the body which secrete hormones. And so in essence, to some degree, it's a list where, I go through, this is a place that makes hormones, it makes these hormones and this is what they do, and then go to the next part on the list. The most time will be at the beginning of this list on the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And as then I go through to other structures, it'll end up, less and less time is needed for each. So for many people, it would be odd that we begin with the hypothalamus. After all, isn't it part of the brain? Yes, and it's an incredibly important part of the brain. Just for reference, if you were to say, look at a mid-sagittal section of this, the brain here, we have the diencephalon region of the brain. Now this would include the pineal gland, which we'll be talking about at the end, and the pituitary gland, which I'll talk about next. But most of the diencephalon is the thalamus, and then underneath that, the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is an incredibly important part of the brain, so it's a major part of the nervous system. But here, as we discuss it, it's also an incredibly important part of the endocrine system. So believe it or not, this hypothalamus, which has so many important aspects in the nervous system with controlling temperature, controlling appetite, having areas which affect gender-specific behaviors in other animals and can be sexually dimorphic, also involves, is the major control center for the autonomic nervous system. It then has three separate ways that it can affect the endocrine system. So not only is it a part of the nervous system, but also the endocrine system. How could the hypothalamus affect the endocrine system? Well, one way you might already be familiar with, because the autonomic nervous system is responsible for that fight or flight response. So for example, messages can be sent, say from the spinal cord through nerves to go to the heart to tell the heart, to beat a little faster, to increase, squeeze more forcefully, etc. However, in addition to nerves in the autonomic nervous system, in the fight or flight response, there is also then epinephrine, which is released from the adrenal medulla. All right, now we'll be talking about the adrenal glands, but epinephrine can be a neurotransmitter. Say if nerve cells release epinephrine from the synaptic knobs of the nerve cell to wherever the target cell is. Now epinephrine is going from one a cell to another. It's acting as a neurotransmitter. But here, as we will see, in the middle of the adrenal gland, in the adrenal medulla, their epinephrine is also released as a hormone. So epinephrine, what's also commonly called adrenaline, this is released during exercise, during an emergency, and as it goes into the blood, it now can reach the heart through the blood, and it can reach all tissues. And so the sympathetic division can cause the release of epinephrine as a hormone into the blood. And given that the hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system, the hypothalamus then is in charge of the release of epinephrine from the adrenal medulla during the stress response as a hormone. The second way that the hypothalamus affects hormone release is a little more involved. And so here, I'd like to just go through the blood vessels in this vicinity. There are arteries which reach the hypothalamus. They then form capillary beds. They then form a portal vein, which then goes to the anterior pituitary, which forms capillary beds. And this then forms the veins, which go back then to the heart. Now, most of my students weren't really paying attention when I said this, and when I asked, what did I say that just shocked you? They look at me kind of confused. But then upon exploring, we realized, wait a minute, this isn't how it's supposed to happen. Usually what happens is an artery forms a capillary bed, which forms a vein that goes back to the heart. Here we have an artery forms a capillary bed, which forms a portal vein, which goes to another capillary bed, which forms the vein that goes back to the heart. So normally it doesn't, run this way, where there's an artery, capillary, portal vein, capillary vein. And so there are two places in our body where we have portal veins, veins between two capillary beds. The reason we have it here in the hypothalamus is that the hypothalamus is going to send hormonal messages to the pituitary. In a normal circulatory system, then a vein could then go to the right atrium of the heart, which goes to the right ventricle, which goes to the lungs, which goes to the left atrium, left ventricle, goes all throughout the body in the hopes that a little would make it here. But because these are so close, that doesn't make sense. Why not just send a little signal directly here? And so what happens in the hypothalamus is that messages can be made here, hormonal messages, which then go through this short portal vein into the anterior pituitary gland, where then these hormonal messages then have their effects. So there's a hypophyseal portal system where the hypothalamus can send information directly to the pituitary gland. Now, in this way, it regulates the pituitary. Very often the pituitary is referred to as the master gland because the pituitary gland, tells other glands what to do. Well, then the hypothalamus tells the pituitary what to do. So in a sense, it is then the master of the master gland. So for example, when should the pituitary gland make growth hormone? Well, the hypothalamus makes GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone. That then goes into this capillary bed, goes in the portal vein, comes out here, and that's the signal for the pituitary to make growth hormone. When does the pituitary stop making growth hormone? Well, now the hypothalamus can make an inhibitory factor, growth hormone inhibitory factor, GHIH, which then inhibits the production of growth hormone from the pituitary. So the pituitary makes growth hormone, but the hypothalamus sends a start signal, growth hormone releasing hormone, and a stop signal, growth hormone inhibitory hormone. In the same way, the hypothalamus then sends a start signal for the production of prolactin, the prolactin releasing hormone that then goes to the pituitary. The pituitary then makes prolactin until the hypothalamus sends the stop hormone, PIH, the prolactin inhibitory hormone, which we now know is dopamine. So dopamine is the inhibitory signal for prolactin. And so there can be other signals that way as well, where the hypothalamus sends both a start signal and a stop signal. So the hypothalamus sends the melanocortin releasing hormone, which tells the pituitary to make the melanocyte stimulating hormone. And then the hypothalamus can make an inhibitory signal as well. So in these examples, the hypothalamus sends a start signal and a stop signal. Now, there is another variant here. So when does the pituitary make FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone, which will stimulate gametogenesis in the gonads? Well, the hypothalamus will make GnRH, the gonadotropin releasing hormone. When the hypothalamus makes GnRH, the gonadotropin releasing hormone, this then stimulates the pituitary to make FSH. FSH then goes to the gonads, say, for example, the ovary then produces estrogen. When does the pituitary stop this? Well, interestingly, there isn't a stop signal. The hypothalamus simply stops making the start signal. So once FSH is in the blood, the ovary makes estrogen, and the hypothalamus samples the blood. So when there's estrogen in the blood, the hypothalamus knows this because it's measuring estrogen levels in the blood. When estrogen levels in the blood are satisfactory, the hypothalamus will stop making GnRH, which was the start signal. Once the hypothalamus stops making GnRH, then the pituitary will stop making FSH. So in this scenario, there isn't a stop signal for FSH. But when the downstream hormone estrogen reaches sufficient levels, the hypothalamus simply stops making the start signal. So that is the second way in which the hypothalamus affects hormone release. It can control when the pituitary makes its hormones, sometimes with both a start and a stop signal, and sometimes with a start signal, which the hypothalamus can then stop. The third way that the hypothalamus can affect hormone release and thus be part of the endocrine system, is that the hypothalamus can release a number of hormones on its own. Now, some of these hormones are released from the posterior pituitary. Well, how do they get there? Well, if you remember what neurons look like, they have their dendrites and their soma, but then they have this long axon. And so there are a number of areas of the hypothalamus where a hormone is made in the soma of a neuron, but it is then transported through axons, which then reach the posterior pituitary. And now the what could be a neurotransmitter, if it was released at a synapse, is now a hormone because it's being released into the blood from the posterior pituitary. So there are a number of hormones which are made in the hypothalamus, but they are released into the blood as hormones from the posterior pituitary. This would include oxytocin, which is a major hormone, especially for mammals. It's the signal for the uterine muscle to contract in live birth. It causes milk letdown by ejecting milk, but it's also involved in the brain. It obviously, when secreted in large quantities, causes orgasm, but then in lower amounts, it probably then contributes to the sense of trust and the reason that we like being in social scenarios. In addition, the pituitary makes what's known as ADH, the antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, which helps to regulate blood pressure and how much water is lost from the kidney. So ADH, or vasopressin, and oxytocin are two major hormones which the hypothalamus actually makes and puts into the blood. There are more. So that goes beyond our little, our introductory discussion here. But for example, if you were to consider weight gain, it turns out that the hypothalamus has a major role in signaling to the body what metabolic rate should be, whether we should be hungry, how high our metabolism should be, what we should be doing with glucose, etc. And so if you look, there's a whole bunch of hormonal signals made in the hypothalamus, which then affect some aspect of weight gain and metabolism. So the hypothalamus affects hormonal release three different ways. One, it controls the release of hormones from the autonomic nervous system. Secondly, it controls when the hormones of the pituitary are released. It is the master of the master gland. And third, it can release hormones directly into circulation. Now, that being said, I have at the bottom of this playlist more information. I don't want to spend much time on it because this is kind of part of an introductory topic, but oxytocin, vasopressin, and the hypothalamus, they are fascinating. And so I have a video just on this. Now, oxytocin can be released as a neurotransmitter. It can be released as a hormone from the posterior pituitary. Interestingly, however, oxytocin can actually be put into the into cerebrospinal fluid. And so oxytocin can be made by brain neurons, travel through the cerebrospinal fluid from one area to another. So potentially that's another aspect of hormonal release. So these spaces, these ventricles here can then also carry something like oxytocin, which can be a hormone. The hypothalamus is so important that we could then split the hypothalamus into regions, and we could talk about say this area, the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. So this region is the source of some of the neurons which reach the posterior pituitary, right? But then there are other nuclei as well. And so, the hypothalamus, could involve this, the diverse aspects of endocrine release as well. Also, as we will see, the hypothalamus controls when the pineal gland makes its hormone melatonin at night. And so, once again, this is kind of introductory, but the hypothalamus is, arguably the major part of the endocrine system, more so than any other single region. And so one could talk about the paraventricular nuclei, the supraoptic nucleus. These are releasing oxytocin and ADH, and how they do that in the cerebrospinal fluid or elsewhere. So the hypothalamus, probably, deserves, far greater attention. But in this introductory, overview, that's all that I would like to do for right now. Onto the pituitary gland, which hangs from the hypothalamus by a stalk known as the infundibulum. And anatomically, where this sits is that little pocket known as the sella turcica, or Turkish saddle, in the sphenoid bone. Now, we split the pituitary into its two halves. Now, I know that seems annoying because it's the size of a pea. Do we really have to split it into two halves? Well, yes, we do, because these two halves, the cells are very distinct. The hormones released here are very distinct. They form in two different parts of the embryo. The anterior pituitary comes from the roof of the mouth, or Rathke's pouch. And so, yes, these are two distinct areas. It actually justifies us splitting them in two and considering them separately. The anterior pituitary makes a number of peptide hormones, which then work through second messenger systems. This includes growth hormone. Now, growth hormone is one of the rare hormones which affects most cells of the body. Thyroid hormones would also be in this category. And in general, the effects are growth promoting, where they tell cells to make more proteins, to divide more frequently, et cetera. Now, obviously, say during a growth spurt in childhood or in puberty, this is important. But we also use this just in a general sense for the maintenance of various tissues. And so growth hormone is made by the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is sometimes referred to as the master gland because it makes hormones which affect other glands. So, for example, TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone. This is the hormone which then tells the thyroid gland to make its hormones, which stimulates the thyroid. In addition, the anterior pituitary sends commands to the gonads with hormones like FSH and LH. Now, FSH is named the follicle stimulating hormone for its role in promoting the development of follicles in the ovary during the menstrual cycle. And the luteinizing hormone is the trigger of ovulation, after which the corpus luteum results. And so these two hormones, they're named for their role in women, and how, and obviously important with fertility. A woman who doesn't, make either of these hormones is infertile. But then the names are a bit deceiving because these hormones are just as important in males. FSH not only promotes the development of gametes in the ovary, it also then promotes the development of gametes in the testis. Not only does LH promote the release of progesterone in the ovary, it will promote the release of testosterone in the testis. So a man who doesn't make these hormones is also infertile. So please don't let the names, allow you to associate these hormones only with women. They are just as important in the fertility of men. So FSH and LH are collectively called the gonadotropins. A tropic hormone is a hormone which affects the release of hormones from another gland. And so, for example, with the ovary, FSH is promoting the release of estrogen, LH is promoting the release of progesterone, although LH is also involved in estrogen. And so therefore they are affecting hormone release of another gland, so they are tropic hormones, and these thus are the gonadotropins. The anterior pituitary also then makes other hormones, such as ACTH. ACTH goes to the adrenal cortex. I know it has a complicated name. Its name means the adrenocorticotropic hormone. So it's going to the adrenal cortex, and it's a tropic hormone affecting the release of hormones from the adrenal cortex. So ACTH is the command that the pituitary gives to cause hormone release from the adrenal gland. The anterior pituitary also makes MSH, named because it stimulates melanocytes, so melanocyte stimulating hormone. It also then makes prolactin, which is a signal to produce milk in mammary glands. Now, a quick comment. This is an introductory lecture, and so everything that was said here was accurate. However, when you think of signals, signals can be used in different, in different ways. So for example, if someone did this, that probably means, hey, doing great. If you're scuba diving, this does not mean, hey, doing great. This does. If you do this when you're scuba diving, it means there's a problem, we have to go up. So be careful. So if someone says, do you have enough oxygen, how much oxygen, you do this, that doesn't mean you're okay, that means you want to rise. But in any case, the same signal can be used in two different scenarios. In the same way, yes, prolactin causes milk development in mammary glands, but that's the effect it has on mammary glands. It has effects all over the body. I mean, fish use prolactin as a hormone. They don't make milk, but prolactin is doing other things like controlling, the pumping of ions, etc. In the mammalian brain, prolactin is the cause of the refractory period after orgasm. So this one hormone can have multiple roles. MSH, it has a role in melanocyte production of melanin. Also, however, MSH is involved in different, areas, so as part of the brain, in appetite, etc. And so some, mutations, say in a melanocortin receptor, might affect pigmentation. So you might have red hair because you're not making the dark form of melanin. But then other mutations of MSH receptors can then cause obesity. And so it's important to remember that just because we associate this hormone with this function, which may be a very important function, maybe its main function, that doesn't preclude it from having other functions in other parts of the body. The same signal can be used in multiple ways. Okay. So the anterior pituitary is a major source of hormones, and a major source of hormones that then affect other areas of the body. If you were to look in the anterior pituitary, here we can see that it's very rich in capillaries. And so the peptide hormones which are produced here, they then go into the capillary blood there. I just wanted to then just go back and show you what these two parts of the pituitary look like under the microscope. So here's the anterior pituitary, which forms in the roof of the mouth. Here's the posterior pituitary, which extends from the hypothalamus. And you can see under the microscope, you can clearly tell the difference between the two. The anterior pituitary, this is where cells are making peptide hormones like growth hormone, ACTH, TSH, etc. Okay, whereas in the posterior pituitary, this is where the axons from the hypothalamus are then extending so that hormones made in the hypothalamus are released from the posterior pituitary. Also, just one thought on hormones. This could apply to both the pituitary and the hypothalamus. Just a casual note. Sometimes what happens is that a protein is made, but there are a couple of examples where this protein actually then gets cut into lots of little pieces. And so then all of the little pieces then could be separate hormones. So there is a protein which is known as the proopiomelanocortin. And then from this one single protein, one single gene, now it can be cut into all of these pieces. These are separate hormones. And many, specifically in this one, have effects on feeding, metabolism, and weight gain. ADH and oxytocin are also produced from larger proteins, which are then cut. So as we go through the glands in our list, the biggest two are the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And now we'll start to move a little bit faster. Around the larynx is the thyroid gland. We have two lateral masses joined by a connecting isthmus. Some animals, so if you're dissecting the cat in Anatomy and Physiology 2, you would just see the two lateral masses, not the connecting isthmus. There's an amino acid called tyrosine, which is in the proteins that you eat. When this gets sent to the thyroid gland, it is modified. Iodine is added, so maybe 3 iodine atoms, maybe 4, forming T3 or T4. T4 is commonly known as thyroxine. T3 is also known as triiodothyronine. And this is an example of a hormone that then has lots of effects throughout the body. So for example, it is very important in development of children for normal, brain, muscular, et cetera, the development here. But then it also helps us to keep warm, as we will see. Now, I think what I'm about to say is unique, or at least I don't know of another example of this. Most glands make hormone as it is needed. The thyroid gland makes hormone and then stores it in this gel, this thyroglobulin. And so the thyroid gland actually, stores maybe about a month's worth of hormone. And as far as I know, I don't know of another example of that where large quantities of hormone are stored. And so here you see follicles with this gel where the hormone is stored. And so that's unique. So the TSH made from the pituitary gland tells the thyroid gland then to release the hormone which has been made. The major effect of thyroxine and T3 is to tell cells, in essence, to do stuff, to increase their metabolism. Muscles contract, neurons pump ions. And one of the effects of this is that we generate heat. So it's a law of physics that whenever energy changes hands, some energy will be wasted as heat. You can never have a reaction which is 100% efficient. So when you use a light bulb, it gets hot after a while. Not all of the energy is being converted into light. When your car runs, the engine, is warm because not all of the energy is being transformed into turning the tires. So waste heat is always made. It's a law of the universe, this entropy. But our bodies make use of that because we would like heat. We're mammals, and we would like to now keep a constant body temperature of about 100 degrees, even in a world where it isn't always 100 degrees. It's cooler at night, it's cooler in winter, it's cooler farther from the equator. But we can have the same body temperature because these thyroid hormones then send the command to now cells do stuff, muscles contract, right? Maybe we would even shiver if it's, dramatic. And so as a result, as cells do stuff, primarily muscles contracting, that's where 85% of our heat is coming from, we then are warmer than our environment. So if you look here on this thermal camera, outside it's a cold winter day, it's cold, all right, but our bodies are far hotter than that because our thyroid glands tell our cells to do stuff. And as a result of doing the stuff like muscle contraction, heat is released. So very important, obviously, for warm-blooded mammals. Now, we'll get back to another thyroid hormone called calcitonin in a second. Before going into the parathyroid glands, just a quick comment. When we were embryos, we started making these pharyngeal arches, the same as all vertebrates. Now, some vertebrates end up putting gills here, but the land-living vertebrates, they just then have to reorganize it. So they start looking as if they're going to develop gills. So this is a pig embryo. And the pig embryo looks like it wants to develop gills with these big pharyngeal arches, the slits between them, et cetera, but then reorganize the whole area. And so from this area, there are parathyroid glands and the thyroid glands, and then they just kind of all smush together and they get reorganized here. Sometimes this is of clinical interest because sometimes as they reorganize, they don't move correctly, and so there could be masses of the thymus or the thyroid in abnormal positions. So here we have the parathyroid glands and the thyroid. Now, once again, you might say, oh, do we really have to make them separate glands? I mean, they're just little nodules inside the other one. Can't we all just call it, say, the thyroid? Well, they come from different embryological sites. And if you look at them, it's easy to distinguish between the thyroid with those follicles from the parathyroid. So here's a parathyroid gland, very different from the thyroid gland. The parathyroid gland makes the hormone parathormone, while the thyroid gland, in addition to making thyroxine and T3, also makes calcitonin. Blood calcium is so critically important because calcium is such an important signaling molecule. If blood calcium goes up by about a third, you can die. If it goes down by about a third, you can die. And so we have to maintain a constant level of calcium in our blood. And that's what calcitonin and parathormone do. Calcitonin will then bring blood calcium down when it's too high. Parathormone will bring blood calcium up when it's too low. And so the thyroid gland, in addition to thyroxine and T3, makes calcitonin, which brings blood calcium levels down when they're too high. And then there are nodules within the thyroid gland known as parathyroid glands, two pairs, which make parathormone. So let's say your blood calcium level is too high. Calcitonin can stimulate osteoblasts in your skeletal system. Osteoblasts make bone. And as we make more bone, our blood calcium decreases because we're sucking calcium out of the blood. Whereas parathormone would want that calcium back. If our blood calcium levels are too low, then what we want to do is dissolve some of our skeleton, which then will release that calcium into our blood, bringing blood calcium levels back to normal. So parathormone stimulates cells known as osteoclasts, which dissolve bone and thus, bring that calcium back into the blood. We can also then change how much calcium we absorb from our small intestine. All right, so if our blood calcium is too high, calcitonin will decrease how much calcium is absorbed from the small intestine. Parathormone would raise how much calcium we reabsorb from our small intestine. And then finally here, if we look at the urinary tubules, if our blood calcium is too high, we want to put more calcium in our urine. So calcitonin would increase how much calcium is in our urine, while parathormone would cause more calcium to be reabsorbed. And so we would excrete less in our urine, right? So this was the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands. Over our kidneys, we have glands known as adrenal glands, and adrenal glands have a cortex and a medulla. The medulla is where epinephrine is released during an emergency. So we have neurons which go to the adrenal medulla, and they produce epinephrine, but not at a synapse. Instead, it is released into the blood. And so now epinephrine, in this case, is actually serving as a hormone entering the blood, and thus is part of the fight and flight response, sending stimuli to muscles for contraction, etc. In addition, however, there's the adrenal cortex, which has three distinct layers. So the adrenal cortex, that would be the medulla there, has three distinct layers, each of the layers making different hormones. One layer makes what are called androgen hormones. Now, just as FSH and LH are often associated with women, and while that's not incorrect, that then overlooks the important roles they play in men. Androgens are often referred to as, say, male hormones and often associated with men. But that's unfortunate because androgens are present in women as well. Because while androgens are made in the testes, they're actually made in the ovaries as well, simply because you have to start with testosterone before you can make estrogen. And so obviously ovaries are making testosterone, otherwise they couldn't do one final step and to convert that into estrogen. But everyone has adrenal glands, and adrenal glands make androgens. So in the adrenal glands over the kidneys, cholesterol is changed to make androgens known as DHEA and DHEAS. And this is sometimes clinically important because, say, if a woman makes too much of this, this could then boost androgen levels in her body higher than what is typically observed in women, and now more typically what is observed in men. So this might promote, facial hair growth or some changes in the woman who's doing it. A woman who's pregnant could actually then potentially produce too much androgen for a female fetus, which would then cause some masculinizing of a female fetus. So the first layer then produces androgen hormones. Androgen hormones promote hair growth in both men and women. It causes behavioral changes. It promotes sex drive. And one of the ways of seeing this is in early puberty, the adrenal glands are making adrenal androgens before the gonads have boosted their production of steroids. And so the changes which we associate with early puberty, such as hair growth, increased sex drive, the change in the odor of the apocrine glands, these are caused by the adrenal glands and that outermost layer, which is making the androgens. The middle layer makes what are called glucocorticoids, which we call cortisol and cortisone. All right, so they bind to receptors, just as estrogen and testosterone are steroid hormones that bind to cytoplasmic receptors. So too the steroid hormones of the adrenal glands, such as cortisol in blue, or binding to the blue receptor, and the one I'll talk about next, aldosterone, here binding to the green receptor. So the adrenal glands are also making steroid hormones. Glucocorticoids such as cortisol and cortisone are well known for their anti-inflammatory capabilities. We can obviously put cortisone on like poison ivy or an itch, etc. However, perhaps a more significant role in this is that it's an important part of the stress response. In a stress response, we want to mobilize glucose reserves so that we have energy to run, to fight, etc. And so part of the stress response is the hypothalamus talking to the pituitary, which then sends messages to the adrenal glands to, say, promote the glucocorticoid release, which then helps to liberate energy reserves throughout the entire body. We call this the HPA axis. Now, in the modern world, we often experience chronic stress going on for long periods of time. And very often it is, the chronic production of glucocorticoids from the adrenal glands, which is involved in the problem. And so as we worry about stress and the negative effects of it, such as, increased weight gain, increased risk of heart attack and stroke, reduced energy to the immune system. Very often we're looking at the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and things which disrupt it. And so this glucocorticoid production is very important for lots of things like the stress response, and then also things we don't like about the stress response. The third layer of the adrenal cortex releases aldosterone, which is a mineral corticoid. It's a steroid hormone. And as we will see with the urinary system, it promotes the reabsorption of salt. So how much salt are you going to put in your urine and eliminate from your body? If you don't make aldosterone, more sodium will end up in your urine. If you make aldosterone, you reabsorb this sodium into your blood. And so that's not only important in the reabsorption of sodium, but also once we reabsorb sodium, we can now reabsorb more water. And so if we're concentrating our urine, say we're dehydrated, say one of the, then aldosterone has its role in that as well. So the adrenal glands are very important endocrine glands, both their cortex with its multiple layers and the adrenal medulla. The pancreas is primarily an exocrine gland making digestive enzymes. So when we look at the pancreas under the microscope, we mostly see exocrine tissue, about 99% of it is exocrine tissue, making the enzymes that help digest our food. But there are these little islands of endocrine tissue, these islets of Langerhans, which make two important hormones that we'll discuss in greater detail in a different chapter. Insulin. Insulin is made when we've eaten a meal to tell our body cells we've eaten a meal. And one of the things we do with insulin is then this brings blood glucose down. After a meal, blood glucose levels can spike, and insulin tells our cells, hey, could you suck up the glucose and then do something with it, bring down our blood glucose levels. In the same way, when we haven't eaten a meal in a while, say at night when we're asleep, these same islets, different cells, can then release glucagon. All right, glucagon is the hormone that tells our body, hey, it's been a while since we've eaten. So liver, if you've stored some glucose, could you release it to help raise our blood glucose levels? So as will be discussed further, with the digestive system, these islets of Langerhans in the pancreas are important in the production of both insulin and glucagon, which regulate our blood glucose levels. Just like calcium, we don't want our blood glucose to be too high or too low. When it's too high, we make insulin, which brings it down. When it's too low, we make glucagon, which brings it up. Okay. The kidney makes the hormone renin. Technically not a hormone. It converts angiotensin into a hormone. We'll get to that. But in general now, we realize, and once again, this is something we can get into in greater detail with the urinary system, there are hormones which control fluid balance. So for example, there's fluid in our blood, there's fluid which we're going to excrete in our urine, but we don't want our blood volume to be too high. That increases blood pressure, damages blood vessel linings, nor do we want blood pressure to be too low when we're dehydrated. We might lose blood pressure to get blood to the brain and back, for example. We want it to be just right. So if we're becoming dehydrated, we want to have less fluid in the urine and to move this back into the blood. So when our fluid levels are going down, we want fluid to go from here to here. So renin is a hormone made by the kidneys, which will cause us to make angiotensin, and that helps to move fluid this way and raise blood pressure. Renin is kind of like a boss hormone that causes the production of ADH, or vasopressin, made in the hypothalamus released from the posterior pituitary. This causes us to reabsorb more water. Renin also then causes us to make aldosterone, which causes us to reabsorb more salt, more sodium, which then helps us reabsorb more water. So these hormones help to move fluid this way. While if we have too much fluid in our body, our heart realizes, wait, look at all this pressure, look at all this fluid, we need to release more. I don't like this much blood volume. So the heart can actually make a hormone, ANP, the atrial natriuretic peptide, which causes fluid to move in the opposite direction and then to be released from the, it can then be released from the blood. In the middle of the chest, deep to the sternum, there's a gland known as the thymus. It is a place where certain types of lymphocytes mature, known as T lymphocytes, and hormones are made here, which are very important for the maturation of these white blood cells. So there are different hormones here. Collectively, they can be called thymosins. All right, but once again, in general, so the thymus then could be included in the endocrine system, releasing hormones important for immune system development. It's larger when we're infants, and it then steadily decreases in size as we age. The diencephalon of the brain not only includes the hypothalamus, which makes hormones, but then also it includes the pineal gland, which is on the posterior side. And the pineal gland is fascinating. Organisms need to know about light. All right, if you're in water, where is light? Is it up? Is it down? But otherwise, is it day or is it night? You know, some animals are only active during the day. Some animals are active only at night. It's important to measure the length of the day, because for a lot of animals, there's a migration season, there's a mating, you know, season, etc. So we need to measure light. Where it is, that's a directional cue. So for example, here, you know which way is up based on where the light is coming from. But then also, how long does it last? Is it day? Is it night? Is it spring? Is it, you know, winter, etc. And so the diencephalon of the brain not only is where the retina first develops, and the retina has cells which can detect light, but then also it has a region which develops as a pineal gland, which can detect light primitively. So the ancient vertebrates actually had a hole, you know, where light could actually enter in and reach pineal cells, which then measure light, and as a result make melatonin. Right. So melatonin is made in 2 steps. First, you make serotonin, and then you can convert that into melatonin. And melatonin can be released as a hormone. So the pineal gland then converts this external signal of light, is there light or not, into an internal signal of a hormone being present or not. Melatonin being a hormone of darkness. We make melatonin when it is dark. All right. Now, in early vertebrates, the pineal gland itself would measure light, and so therefore the measuring of light could then, you know, cause the release of melatonin. We mammals, we don't do that. The pineal is no longer measuring light because, among other things, the big cerebrum grew over it. And so now the eyes communicate with the hypothalamus and what's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The suprachiasmatic nucleus then communicates to the pineal gland. So here's another way that the hypothalamus is affecting hormone release. The suprachiasmatic nucleus then goes to the pineal gland, which is here, and the pineal gland now releases melatonin when it's dark. All right. And so the pineal gland makes melatonin. Now, it was originally named because it was noticed in experimental animals that it could cause changes in pigmentation, you know, and that's important. However, it's far more important because, one, it introduces this idea of circadian rhythms. Since your body does tell time, you know when it's day or night. And so therefore, there are these certain parts of your physiology which follow a cycle of about 24 hours. So your body temperature changes over the course of a day, you know, by a degree or so. The amount of urine that you make can change by, you know, over the course of a day. The hormones that you make, you know, males can make more testosterone typically during the morning. And then there are longer cycles. Obviously, there's a menstrual cycle, but then, you know, we're a little different in spring than we are in winter. And so we do tell time. And now this melatonin allows for that. It allows for these circadian rhythms because there's a hormone that is going into the blood, you know, more during one part of the cycle than another cycle. Thanks to the eyes connecting to the hypothalamus, which connects to the pineal, then this can then be entrained to the light outside. So we have this internal clock, which we can then match to the external clock. The hypothalamus goes to the superior cervical ganglion specifically, which then goes to the pineal gland. And so then light coming from the eyes goes here, goes there, goes there. And so this gland's hormone secretion matches what we see then outside with light. Of the many things that we could say about melatonin, it has so many good functions, especially for the immune system. All right, so melatonin will tend to stop, you know, or decrease the number of cancer cells, which will then undergo metastasis. It affects, you know, NK cells in the immune system. It affects how T cells differentiate. It affects the local hormones being produced. So I go through a number of specific effects. In general, it helps the immune system and has very beneficial effects on the immune system. And this then is why it's a little concerning then that we in the modern world have less darkness. We have lights on, which wasn't ancestrally the case. When the sun went down, it was then dark. We can work night shifts and then trying to sleep in the day when it's not quite as dark. We could, work the night shift one day, work the night shift another day. We could go from one part of the world to another part of the world and experience jet lag because we're experiencing light when our brain was expecting it to be dark. So the point is, look at this. This is the lights of a city overhead. There shouldn't be that many people active when the sun is down. And so as a result, we can test this definitely with animals, but certainly this seems to be the case in humans, and especially, people in the health field, which are doing a lot of night shifts at the emergency room or whatever, that if you're not producing the right amount of melatonin, this can lead not only to sleep disorders, but also have a number of serious health consequences. So it turns out that melatonin has very good effects in the body. Okay. Now, we could certainly, keep on adding to this list, because so many of the cells of the body are actually making hormones. In my classes, we start to wind down here because some of these other areas are things that will be mentioned in upcoming chapters. So the digestive system makes hormones. The stomach makes gastrin. The small intestine makes hormones like CCK, the gastric inhibitory peptide secretin, etc. And so the organs of the digestive system, since they make hormones, can also be included in this endocrine system. One of the, we often talk about a brain-body connection. And one of the things, this we could argue, is that we know that nerve cells touch muscles, and they have neuromuscular junctions, neuroglandular junctions. But there are weird neural synapses in the autonomic nervous system where axons, form this series of synaptic knobs. And while there's no cell which is 100% fixed to the area, so forming a definite physical synapse, white blood cells are in and out. And white blood cells have receptors for neurotransmitters. So here, it's a synapse, but it's a different kind of synapse where, neurotransmitters are affecting white blood cells that they're not actually, directly connected to. But then the white blood cells can then make signals as well that affect the neurons. And so this then is, confusing as far as when we talk about signaling, who's affecting who? When does a signal, when is it a neurotransmitter? When is it a hormone? But in any case, we do have chemical signals which affect the immune system. All right, so immune cells are target cells, and so our state of body, how much stress we're under, that can clearly then have effects on immunity, how frequently we become ill. One of the things which was a big discovery is that adipose cells and adipose tissue, that this tissue makes signals. And so not only is adipose important in the sense, but now it then asks the question, how much weight have we gained? And how would this then disrupt the immune aspects of the body? And so adipose cells specifically, they make hormones such as leptin, adiponectin, and others, but then also adipose tissue can have white blood cells. The white blood cells can make signals. And so then not only is this important, as once again can be covered in other chapters, leptin not only tells our brain that we shouldn't be as hungry, it's a trigger for when puberty should begin because, especially in young girls, the expenses of reproduction, certainly a lot of calories are needed, to carry a fetus to term and for lactation afterwards. Nutrition is tied to pubertal onset in women, so that the leptin which is the fat cell's way of telling the brain, hey, we've stored some energy here. The hypothalamus then measures when has enough energy been stored so that reproduction can begin. These hormones, certainly, they affect white blood cells as well. And so another aspect, perhaps, beyond our consideration here, as we gain weight, we change the amount of hormone which is made. And since these hormones are affecting the brain and, and reproduction, since they're affecting white blood cells, what effect does, weight gain have on our bodies because of the hormones that the fat cells are making, that the white blood cells in the adipose tissue is making, etc. So we could certainly go on and on because it turns out that the signaling between cells is so very, very important. And so if we're asking what would cause type 1 diabetes, very often we're now looking at what local hormones are being produced, what inflammatory signals are being produced, and what effect does this have on the cells of the pancreas. All right, and so once again, at a certain point in this introduction, it's time to move on. But you shouldn't then be surprised that when you're talking about immunity or diabetes or weight gain, that you're now dealing with hormonal signals again. So once again, adipose tissue has all of these inflammatory signals coming from it. Some are coming from the adipose cells themselves, some by the white blood cells. But thus, as we gain weight, we're promoting more inflammation, which will make our risk of asthma worse, our risk of heart disease worse, etc. And so just because that's such an important point, we can get to it again later. I just have this obese cat here, and just it's one thing to say, oh, look at all of that energy that's being stored, but also think of it now as an endocrine organ. All right, so adipose is making hormones. So now this cat's making all these different hormones. See all this adipose in the viscera and the greater omentum, etc. So the hormones that are being produced in this obese cat are now different from the hormones of a non-obese cat. What effects is that having on the immune system and all of the other systems of the body? Obviously, the reproductive system involves many hormones, not just in the production of gametes, but then also when we look at the development of embryos across the placenta. So clearly, the gonads are endocrine structures. The placenta is itself an endocrine structure. So when we look at the development of the follicle, there are hormones going back and forth between the secondary oocyte and the cells around it, etc. So the endocrine system is so much bigger than we think it to be. I'm sorry, before we get to the last point, also then if you look at embryonic development, obviously a ball of cells, an embryo, then has questions. All right, where do I put a nervous system? Where do I put an arm? Where do I put a leg? And so very often there's all of these signals which are made in embryos, which are essentially sending, the signal, put an arm here. So here you see a limb bud in a developing chick, and there is this zone of polarizing activity which sends out a signal, which is essentially saying, this is where a limb goes. So hormones then, such as the sonic hedgehog being released here, yes, there is an important gene named after a video character, can then be important signaling aspects in the developing embryo. So this video is meant to just provide an overview of all of the parts of the body which make hormones, the hormones that they make, and then the roles that these hormones have. Now, another topic, that's just the last point, that in addition to making a hormone, another important question is, well, what level of a hormone are you making? So it's not just enough to make the hormone. It's a question of, do you make the right amount of the hormone? And when we look at patients, very often what is causing a patient's problem is that they are making either too much of a hormone, that's what's known as a hypersecretion, or too little of a hormone, this is known as a hyposecretion. So for each of the hormones mentioned, obviously there were a lot, you could then ask, well, what negative effects are associated with making too much of this or making too little of this? In my classes, one of the things I do is I have these 2 videos where these 6 patients are all hypersecreting a hormone. There's a hormone that they're making too much of. And based on the information I went over here, that you would then match each patient to which of these hormones that they're making too much of. And then in the next video, same question, but now match each patient to the hormone that they're making too little of. So obviously there was a pretty long list of hormones that was just covered. But now when you think of clinical conditions, you have to not only think of the hormone, but also like what happens if you make too much, what happens if you make too little, even maybe what happens if you make it in the wrong part of the body, like it should be made over here, but what happens if it's made over here? So might cancer then be caused by making this hormone, which promotes growth, in a tissue where it normally isn't associated with, for example. So that's these 2 videos. And the very last one, my students, this is me a bit younger apparently, but my students, as they try to memorize the hormones, what they do, et cetera, it's a long list. And obviously this is important for their futures, but I don't want to get it wrong on an exam, for example. So I adapted Tom Petty's song, Free Falling. So all respect to Tom Petty. And then I just, made a little, ditty helping, people to, match hormones to their roles, et cetera. So I don't have this on my YouTube channel just because, once again, Tom Petty song, all respect to Tom Petty. One of my students once taped it and put it online. So here's a version of this song, if that helps you learn the hormones. So this video was meant to provide an overview of all of the parts of the body which make hormones and what these hormones